The general scheme of this place, of course, was that men would be put to hard labour gathering raw materials, and other men would be put to task making things from those raw materials. Port Arthur always had an industrial side. Now, the most plentiful and most valuable raw material here was timber. Various species of eucalypts, which were described as being 150 feet to the first branch. Convicts produced anything from broomsticks to boats and ships. And this clearing we're coming alongside on your left-hand side is the dockyard, where they produced around 200 vessels altogether. The majority of these were longboats or whale boats. Whaling was a major industry in this early colony of Van Diemen's Land, so you can imagine craft like that being in big demand, and ships would travel from all over the world to hunt in these very fertile waters. A longboat is a very similar craft, but they were used to transport goods and personnel around the bays and inlets of this early colony, when travel across country was often quite difficult, if not totally impossible. But they built larger ships as well. The largest ship built at Port Arthur was 286 tonnes. She was also the largest ship built in the colony at that point in time. What you can see sitting in one of the old slipways is an artist's sculptural representation of one of those craft under construction. Now, the operation at the dockyard was fairly independent of the rest of Port Arthur. They had their own blacksmith shops where they could make their own metal fittings and fastenings. They had their own saw pits. They used to use steamers. Steamers allowed the timbers to be heated up, makes them more pliable so they can be bent to the appropriate shapes. Up the back of that complex was a big shed where they used to cut and sew the canvas sails, as well as make up the rigging. And of course all of this was under the watchful eye of a master shipwright, the first being John Watson and later David Hoy, who used to live in that white weatherboard building, one of the oldest surviving wooden buildings in Port Arthur. Now, there was never a problem with the quality or quantity of produce here. The major problem was the ships were very well built, but they were also very cheaply built. They were often sold on the open market for what would be, for a private shipwright, almost cost price. And you can understand that these private entrepreneurs were a bit upset by that. They protested through the Lieutenant Governor's Department and finally had their case heard that they couldn't compete with convict labour in a settlement like this. So eventually the dockyard was closed down in 1848 but not before they had produced 200 boats and ships, and they also used to carry out very handy and timely repairs to any ships around the coast experiencing difficulty. Now it's quite a pleasant walk around to the dockyard. You just hop onto the road above the jetty, walk along a nice tree-lined avenue and you were there. I recommend take your camera because there are some lovely images to be captured looking out across the bay. The settlement you can see in front is called Carnarvon. It originally started as a few fishermen's shacks and weekenders, but it is a residential area now. But it was actually the site of their brickfields where they used to gather the clay and fire their bricks. They could make tens of thousands per month if it was necessary, and it quite often was. If you keep on following that road, you can make it to Safety Cove, which is an absolutely beautiful beach, and further on, of course, is the Lookout and remarkable cave. Not much of a detour, but it's well worth the look. Now we're travelling towards a headland which is called Point Puer. That's spelled P-U-E-R, which is Latin for youth or boy. It was named as such in 1834 when they established a specifically designed juvenile prison here. It was the first sanctioned juvenile prison under British control, and the average age of a convict was around 12 to 15, but the youngest of them were only 9 years of age. They were the pickpockets, the petty thieves, who came from the larger industrial towns of Great Britain, but the majority seemed to have come from London and the London districts. And they were the artful dodgers, but very much the real thing. People are often appalled at the fact that they were transporting children as young as 9, but the sadder fact is that the age of responsibility in Britain at this time was age 7. A boy or girl caught and convicted could be thrown into jail at that age, but the problem was it was the same jails for everybody, men, women and children. These places were grossly overcrowded, they were rife with corruption, and the thinking people of the day figured that these young people were actually learning more about the ways of crime within the walls of the prison than they were on the outside. They called these places universities of crime. Lieutenant Governor Arthur was made aware of a similar circumstance with boys being transported to Van Diemen's Land and spending considerable time in the Hobart barracks in contact with established criminals. So the idea of Point Puer was born, and ably assisted by his commandant, Captain Charles O'Hara Booth, they set about trying to change the system. The idea, of course, prime purpose, was to keep the boys well away from the corrupting influence of adult convicts, and particularly those at Port Arthur. They could be taught how to read and write, basic arithmetic, taught trades like carpentry, boot and shoe making, barrel making, bit of boat building in the early days, stone cutting. Now most of this stonework in the Port Arthur Church and Military Guard Tower would have been carved by these boys, and we assume it's the rougher work that you'll see on the inside of these buildings rather than the finer work on the facings. Of course, they received religious instruction as well. This was moral reformation, and it was compulsory throughout the entire convict system. And once a boy was considered suitable, he could then be taken to a hiring depot, which was out at Newtown, and from there distributed throughout the colony as a useful worker. So they were trying to steer the boys onto a different path, and with their new trade, they're hoping they won't resort to their old trade again and would become an integrated member of the society of these new colonies. Some boys certainly grasped that opportunity. Unfortunately, others didn't. For them, it was hard labour, solitary confinement, deprivation of rations, and corporal punishment. Corporal punishment was part of Point Puer, but thankfully never to the degree that it was applied back at the main settlement of Port Arthur. As we go past this little beach, you can see a stone wall. That's where the saw pits were, and up through the bush you can see a few foundations and footings. This is all that remains of what was quite a large establishment, Most of the buildings had stone or brick foundations, but the upper parts were made out of timber. And when they abandoned this site in the 1840s, they actually dismantled the buildings and recycled the raw materials. Problems with Point Puer was about resources and the fact that it was such a cold, windswept place. All resources had to be taken over there, and this includes water even, all the materials for their trades, rations, etc. So this almost guaranteed contact between the boys and convicts who were performing that task, and the thriving black market would grow because of that, tobacco being the main currency, of course. But it's a very important historic site, the first sanctioned juvenile prison under British control. Now another important historic site, of course, is the small island. This is Isle of the Dead, or as convicts like to call it, Dead Island. They were certainly in possession of a less romantic view than the authorities of this place. We believe it's the last resting place of around 1,100 people. The majority of those, as you can imagine, are convicts. To give them their proper status, convicts, means convicted person, invalids, there's a person who can't work properly because of illness or injury, and paupers, who are men who have grown old within the system and simply had nowhere else to go, no other means of support. And finally, lunatics. The term lunatic means you're off with the moon, or to suffer severe mental illness. They're all buried along that southern end, and there's not a great deal of evidence of that, because there's policy about which have been lived in shame, disgrace, or as they've been asked to perform. It was going to be relaxed to it somewhat in the 1850s, and the convict was permitted to have a headstone at some point. Very few headstones. Now throughout the great part of the harbour, out towards the mouth of the harbour, access to and from Port Arthur and places elsewhere, we were to turn this vessel about due south, and its landfall would be the continent of Antarctica. And at this point there is nothing else between us and that very cold place, apart from the absolutely vast expanse which is the Southern Ocean. The cliffs of Point Puer, of course, are quite prominent as well, and boys would scramble down those cliffs and gather on the rocks out of view, and they would light fires, cook potatoes that they'd stolen, catch fish, smoke tobacco. Thomas Lampierre, the commissariat here, stood on top of the cliff and looked down. He said they scuttled away like little crabs. If we look towards Isle of the Dead once more and put an imaginary line down the centre of that, the left-hand side is the southern end, convicts, etc. But the right-hand side of the island, the higher ground, was reserved for burial of free people. These were members of the military, civilian establishment, and members of their families. About 180 men, women and children, and given their status, they received due burial in a lot of cases, some quite beautifully carved headstones as well. You may be able to catch a glimpse of some of those as we go past. So two distinctly different cemeteries within the one island, the high ground for the free, the low ground for the bond. The small island was selected and named by a Wesleyan minister, the Reverend John Allen Manton, in 1833, who described it as a secure and undisturbed resting place where those departed prisoners may lie together and await the morning of resurrection. Causes of the death of Port Arthur were not exclusive to this place. In fact, the death rate of Port Arthur compares favourably with the rest of the colony of Van Diemen's Land. Life was hard for all people. The difference is that Port Arthur was designed to be hard, a secondary punishment station. Work accidents were fairly frequent. Men working in the timber gangs of the quarries suffer fatal accidents, men hit by falling trees and branches and so on. These men were wearing leg irons, which meant if anything went wrong, they didn't have much opportunity to get out of the way of falling branches and trees. Drownings were fairly common. It's a time in history when not many people could swim, and there was always a lot of activity on or around water. If somebody fell into the water, even people around them may not be able to assist them. Respiratory diseases affected convicts here. Tuberculosis affected convict and free person alike. They called it consumption, and it was a scourge of the 19th century. Diet-related diseases affected convicts. By the 1830s, over 70% of the convicts here were affected by scurvy. Reason being that their own private vegetable gardens were scrabbed out, and the diet then was just a lump of meat and a lump of bread. Now, scurvy flared up fairly quickly, and their remedy was to plant huge communal gardens on the flat ground in front of the church. They produced copious amounts of potatoes and turnips, and in particular cabbages. One season here they produced over 10,000 cabbages, and that was essentially the end of scurvy. And what vegetables they didn't use fresh, they used to pickle, and pickled vegetables is very good because vinegar is good for scurvy as well. Among the women on the island, the most common cause of death seems to have been childbirth, due to hemorrhage or secondary infection. And once again, if that occurred, there wasn't a great deal that could be done for these people at this point in time. Without doubt, the easiest of all of the secondary punishment stations to survive. So this harbour was also the front gate of the prison, the interface between Port Arthur and the rest of the world. The back gate of the prison being Eagle Hawk Neck, with its military garrison and line of savage dogs. The whole of the peninsula was the actual jail. It was also a source of food. They used to catch fish, never to the extent that we would imagine. The problem would be no means of refrigeration, of course, but they used to keep them cool by putting them in wooden troughs and putting kelp over the top of them, but they would have to use these fairly quickly. Also, on any given day, there would be traffic to and from around the harbour. Commandant might be travelling over to Point Puer on his duty, the doctor might be travelling over to Point Puer or another part of the settlement. You might see two longboats, one with the crew rowing, the other behind it being towed, and there would be a coffin in that. There was a burial party on its way to Isle of the Dead. Now we'll have you back on shore shortly, folks, and on behalf of crew and captain, I wish you an interesting and pleasant day.